Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Soulganize Your Life podcast. And I will say the more that I am soulganizing my own life, the more I'm enjoying being a human. And as a psychotherapist, I often try to point out to clients that there's two ways that I am personally stimulated and I see them stimulated. And one is through an outer circumstance that will stimulate the ego, which I would call a version of a separate self or preferences that we each have. And then also will stimulate our divine soul connection to all that is. So, why is it important to know the difference? Well, that is where our guests come in. I feel they're invaluable information to help us relate to the inner conflicts that we all are experiencing between the ego and the soul, and give us ideas on how to integrate these two perspectives into one full, beautiful human experience. And I'm very excited today to have Chief Philip Scott on the podcast to talk about something that I know absolutely nothing about, which is Indigenous culture. And I don't even want to try to attempt to introduce him, so I'm going to let him introduce himself.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you today, Win. And I'm known as Shunkawakan Sapa, which is Lakota for Black Horse. I'm a ceremonial leader in the Lakota tradition. I'm a member of respected Indigenous medicine families. And I'm founder and director of Ancestral Voice Institute for Indigenous Lifeways, that is located in the San Francisco Bay Area, which is home to the coastal Miwok, Ohlone, and Pomo nations, as well as other nations that are indigenous. And we just celebrated our 30th anniversary last year. So
wow. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I will say, as a typical American, I'm embarrassed to say how little I know or reference or even notice that there are indigenous nations still a part of our country. In Illinois here, I went to U of I where we have Chief Illini Wick, and you kind of hear these things, and I'm really excited for you to just teach me what it's really about instead of my cartoonish viewpoint. And before we started talking or recording, I was talking about that this podcast focuses on the ego and the soul. And I think you were starting to explain to me in the way that an indigenous person would see it, and more as a connection between a whole bunch of separate parts of ourselves or disconnected parts to ourselves that you help integrate. So I'm just curious, from your point of view, if you maybe wouldn't call it the ego, what would you call it, and how would you define what it is that you see?
Well, so we are, as a human being, composite of body, mind, heart, and spirit. And they're in an intimate dance with one another, and they're interrelated and interconnected. So for me, what is often regarded as the ego would be referred to as mind, right? That
Okay.
we have this abiding self and a perception of ourselves, right? Which is like an image, if you will. And, within Asian cultures as well as indigenous cultures, there is no continuity, or meaning there's no static self that we have. There's no something that we identify with that doesn't evolve and change over time. And so essentially there's no abiding ego or self. It's
Okay.
basically an evolving aspect of ourselves as we grow and mature and evolve as a human
Mm-hmm.
being on this planet, right? Similarly, we have also what's known as your spirit, right? Your spirit is your energy body, your double, right? It's something that, when we sleep at night, our spirit travels to the dream time to have experiences and to encounter other realities and other dreams and other realms, right? Where we can also connect with the ancestors, right? So dreams are very important in indigenous cultures because they're a nexus, a bridge between our waking world and the world of dreams and the world that is beyond when we, depart from this place, right?
Yeah.
And so that's our spirit, right? Then, of course, our soul is our animating force, right? Now, both the spirit and the soul are inviolable, meaning they cannot be harmed.
Right.
Whereas, our mind, our ego, our identity, ourselves, our physical bodies as well, and even our hearts can be harmed through the experiences that we have in our lives, right? In the form of traumas that we endure, often in the crucible of our childhood, right?
Yeah.
And, through our parental upbringing, through our society and our culture. right? And so, the potency and the beauty of indigenous practices is that, they've been on this planet for thousands of years, right? And so they have very elaborate ceremonies that help people to heal from the traumas that they've endured in their lives, right?
Mm.
To help bring back parts of ourself that we have lost, for example, right? So I guess in the terminology of psychology and psychiatry, they'd say there's a dissociative event that occurs at the time of that trauma,
Yes.
and it's regarded as what's known as soul loss within indigenous cultures, right? Or energetic loss. And so
Mhm.
sometimes that can return on its own, right? The energy that was lost. Whereas in other instances, it requires the assistance of a medicine person who can retrieve that energy, or that soul aspect, if you will, the part of them of oneself that was lost, and reincorporate it back into the person to help them integrate that story, right? Because the trauma is a story that continues to play itself out in our lives in the forms
Mm.
of patterns, or maybe even also a consequence of addictions, for example, in response to that trauma. So, um, therefore, indigenous practices throughout the world, and medicine ways and ceremonies and rites of passage and rituals, all of these can support the individual in achieving a sense of balance, peace, sobriety, and harmony again.
Yeah. So before you encountered all these ceremonies yourself, right, in this indigenous way, I'm guessing that you, what I would call the suffering of the ego, you would call some disassociation or some loss of energy from your field. Do you mind sharing a little bit about what that might have looked like for you as a young person?
Well, I grew up in an alcoholic environment, with a very abusive father. And so consequently, there was violence in the home. And
Mm.
so that was really the, springboard for my awakening, right? So the adversities and the challenges that we experience can either traumatize us and hold us back, or they can be our launch pad. And
Yeah.
so, um, as a counterpoint to, the abuse and violence that I endured as a young boy growing up, in that kind of arena and field of addiction, I was having what are called big medicine dreams when I was 6 years of age, when I was being visited by indigenous ancestors, right?
Wow.
At the age of 7, I had a near death experience, which opened up these portals where I could also then see spirits and ancestral forces in our ordinary waking world, right? And then I was trained in my dreams from 7 to 17 until I made a formal commitment to walk the Native American path, the Red Road. And
Wow.
then eventually found medicine people, traditional medicine people, with whom I apprenticed, and did so for decades, and then was granted permission to conduct ceremonies myself after a deep and extended immersion in that way of life. And
Wow.
so, um, we indigenous people have very elaborate ceremonies and healing ways that are thousands of years old. And so they're
Wow.
very potent and very efficacious.
Yeah.
And personally, considering the trajectory of our species on this really unsustainable way, that is continuing to harm our mother, the earth, and to harm one another, um, I believe that our survival as a species is really contingent upon remembering the way that our ancestors, and what I mean by ancestors is all beings that have been on this planet, because even, Western colonial people have indigenous ancestors from Europe and elsewhere who cultivated a relationship with the earth and with the unseen, with the ancestors. And so it's really essential and incumbent for us in our current modern society to remember how our indigenous ancestors from all over the world had uh, really were able to find balance and harmony, healing, and peace in our
Yeah.
world, and to cultivate an intimate relationship with Mother Earth.
Yeah, I'm so thankful that to hear that you had these big medicine dreams and you had these experiences where, if you didn't have a fellow human sort of helping guide you through the trauma that you were experiencing as a child, that you had this, wonderful connection to spirit and soul that was teaching you and training you. And imagine, I know that you've come across probably so many people that didn't have big medicine dreams and didn't have access to that and would have developed what I would call a strong ego of maybe disassociating or, like you said, addiction or something like that. How do you imagine somebody like that might show up by the time they're 17, what you went through, where you were already ready to be a medicine person by the age of 17, and like the type of maybe the traumas or things that you've seen in other people that now have to be like, okay, how can these ceremonies help me now? I didn't grow up with big medicine dreams. And what does that look like?
Well, certainly. I mean, I have people from all walks of life who come to my altar and to the ceremonies to receive healing. So it's not necessary that you've had big medicine dreams prior to that, or
Yeah.
even the callings to become a medicine person. But these ceremonies create a container, and the spirits doctor the individuals within to help retrieve parts of themselves that they have lost through
Yeah.
trauma, through injury. And yeah, they're extraordinarily potent and powerful, and again, help to restore a sense of balance, peace, harmony, and healing for the individual, but also relationally, right? So even though I grew up in that rather abusive environment, that tyranny was the springboard for my awakening,
Yeah.
right? And so
Yeah.
through the work that I did with my medicine teachers, they helped me to reframe that story and to forgive those who had harmed me, but also to reclaim and the medicine from those traumatic
Mm.
experiences, right? Because
Yeah.
in every dis-ease, right, is medicine. And
Yeah.
so, if we can glean the lessons and the learnings from our challenges, from our adversities, then that's how we garner strength and resiliency and flexibility and adaptability.
Yeah. So I guess so often in, traditional clinical therapy, people kind of come in thinking they're damaged beyond repair. And I love what you're saying because really you're just retrieving something that was lost. And that is such a beautiful way to think about it. Doesn't matter what you've been through, it doesn't matter what you think you've done to yourself through an addiction or through any other abuse that you may have experienced, or even if it's, just like you said, relationships or feeling lonely or dissociated a little bit without trauma. There's something was lost and it can be easily retrieved, not easily maybe, but can be retrieved if you'll just give yourself over to something like this that is so profound. Like you said, just thousands of years of people honing and creating an energetic field of healing. And then you're learning it literally within your dream systems and then meeting actual humans, right, that will guide you into like how to actually do the ceremonies and sort of approve of that. And I mean, just the amount of, I guess, sacredness and love and attention that went into the place that you are now is amazing. I mean, that just sounds amazing. It just sounds like such a dedicated, embodied, like I can imagine like people just walk near you and they probably feel some sense of a change.
Sorry for a moment, I got someone at the door. They're
Oh, that's okay.
cleansing the landscape outside. Hopefully, that can be kind of removed from the recording
Yeah.
there.
Yeah, no worries.
Kind of
Life happens.
happening outside. So indeed, the gift or the blessing of this is it requires tremendous devotion and discipline, right? An apprenticeship is an ordeal, and it requires time, which is often what many people in the modern world are lacking. All right, so there's
Yes.
a compelling urge for shortcuts, and which is problematic in terms of medicine ways, and their the ability to embody them when people don't cultivate that patience and that discipline and that dedication and devotion. However, to move with what you had shared a little bit earlier, well, human beings currently have such a profound and fundamental disconnection from the earth.
Yeah.
And there's not an understanding that she is a living, sentient organism who is our mother, right? That's why many, in terms of kinship terminology, right, the earth is regarded as mother in many indigenous cultures, right?
Yes.
And that's not an arbitrary word that we employ, right? So there's literally an understanding that she is the giver of life on this
Mm,
planet. And we have a reverence and a respect for her and an appreciation for the gifts of life that she bestows. And
yeah.
that's why there are many indigenous people and others who are land protectors, right?
Mhm.
Individuals who are literally putting their life on the line for earth, air, fire, and water, right? And so I think it's really essential for us as human beings to begin to remember that intimate relationship with her, because we are literally on an unsustainable trajectory based on incessant consumption and
Yeah.
exploitation of her. And as a consequence, there's a collective suffering that we are all enduring right now as a
Yeah.
result of the climate crisis, right? And the concern for the future welfare of all of our relations on this planet. And so it's necessary and essential for every human being to begin to have a much deeper respect and reverence for our mother, the earth, and for all life upon her, right? Because in the Lakota language, as we conclude our prayers, we say Mitakuye Oyasin. And Mitakuye Oyasin means all of my relations. So
Mm,
every single being on this planet is a relative,
yeah.
right? And we need to treat our relations with respect and kindness and love. And similarly, we see all of the wars that are being waged throughout the world. And these are our family members, right? And so we have to learn how to get along, how to be able to utilize again ancient systems of peace and reconciliation and dialogue for us to come together to have greater understanding. And that doesn't necessarily mean there has to be agreement, but the
Hmm.
discord that we have does not have to engender violence toward one another, right? We
Absolutely.
can find ways to have peace. And obviously, this peace starts within ourselves first, right? To have
Mm,
love and appreciation for oneself, for the gifts that you have to offer the world, what we call your original medicine, your original instructions, which are essential for all people to discover. And so, this is my prayer, and this is what we continue to aspire to do here at this institute, is for us to remember how to be human beings. And
yeah.
I believe that we have forgotten that in our incessant quest to to promote a technology that often dehumanizes us. I
Yeah.
think continues to create even a deeper grief and despair in our human condition. And so it's important for us to, now again, I'm not a Luddite. We're obviously using technology here to have our conversation, but I do believe that, it's important that we are not um, victimized by our technology, but that we are its master, right? So
Yeah.
we're not enslaved by systems, but rather we are, the masters of them, right?
Yeah. So just, I live right outside of Chicago, and I mean, it's mostly concrete. And, I'm often trying to go out into the woods or in nature. So I feel a little bit of that, but I wonder if part of the reason why someone like myself doesn't make that big of a change isn't because I'm not educated on with the climate or what these things are doing, but that I haven't had a full body understanding, maybe through a ceremony or a ritual that actually actually energetically reconnects me to the earth. Because I'm always wondering, like, we have so much information. It's not like we don't know. It's not like, you know what I'm saying? But I think what you're saying is there's a deeper thing that has to happen for individuals to actually feel it, not just think it, but feel it. And that is what you're hoping to do on many levels with people, whether individually or with a group. Is that right?
Absolutely. Part of our objective here is to decolonize ourselves, to
Wow.
remember to re-indigenize ourselves, right? Because we're all indigenous. We've all come from the earth. We all have ancestors that had that relationship I mentioned earlier. And so that's ultimately the quest. So people may have an intellectual understanding,
Yeah.
right? Most people, and we in the Western, educational paradigm, we tend to deify the mind, right? And
Hmm.
so intellectually, people may have an understanding of it, but this is a more embodied, somatic experience of one's fundamental connection to the earth and
Yeah.
all of creation.
Yeah.
And if an individual doesn't have, say, access to traditional ceremonies, well, there's
Mm.
still the opportunity to have that experience pragmatically. And it starts with, taking off one's socks and shoes and walking barefoot on the earth. Now, perhaps right now in the wintertime in Chicago, that may not be most, wise.
Yeah.
However, when the spring thaw comes, take one's socks and shoes off and begin to walk barefoot on the earth. Begin to make that direct connection, to also become aware of the indigenous nations that are a part of your area. Because essentially, as I mentioned in the acknowledgement of myself here in the San Francisco Bay Area, there
Yeah.
were nations that have stewarded this particular beautiful watershed for millennia. And so
Wow.
I'm a guest here. And so I'm cognizant of them and aware of their plight, and the challenges that they're facing to protect their identity and their language and their culture and their sovereignty and self-determination. And so it's important. Then we become, in allyship with them, right? And
I mean,
so
I think what you just said about being a guest here just kind of like set me back. I'm like, I have never thought about that in that way. And I think my ego would certainly not ever acknowledge that, right? Um, but that, yeah, that we're a guest here. Wow, that's a deep statement. I just wanted to point that out. I was like, oh, well, I never thought about it that way. Like you said, colonization is about taking dominion and raping the land for all that you can. And it seems like a good idea. You're more comfortable. You have heat and you have cars, and it seemed like a good idea. Is there some happy balance that you see? Or do you believe that ultimately humans need to go back to something much that we can't even recognize right now?
so that's a great question. I think for me, this is all about balance. But what I
Mm.
will say, in addition to the ravaging of the earth through colonization, we also have the extermination of people. We're talking
Yeah,
about genocide, right?
yeah,
We see, unfortunately, we see this mentality of conquest and consumption playing itself out in spades in our modern world right now, right?
yeah,
And so, we have these technologies, and again, it kind of goes back to what I mentioned about enslavement, right? So either technologies can be a tool to help improve our lives, or we can become enslaved by them.
yeah,
And so, and then of course, the technology then becomes oppressive itself, right?
yeah,
That we have created, right? So, the point is to, what I encourage my students and my clients to do is to make sure that you have to start with integrity. You have to start with walking your talk. So, you know, in my home there are no poisons here, right? There's
mm,
nothing that can harm the earth. So this is about looking at the contents of the products that we purchase and consume, right? Are we making sure that we are recycling and reusing, right? Are we trying to decrease our impact, and our carbon footprint? on the earth. I mean, this
Yeah.
is fundamentally where it starts, right? Is that it has to begin with ourselves and our own lives. And so also related to healing, right? So being able to, the word I use is excavate, right? To excavate oneself, to take that deep dive, to do reflection and recapitulation, right? To introspection, particularly in the time of winter, right? So the other aspect of helping to become more indigenous is to become aware of the cycles, the seasonal
Mhm.
cycles, the lunar and solar cycles, right? Because we
Mhm.
are an animal on this earth as well. And so we are subject to these rhythms. And so, here in the Northern Hemisphere, it's a time of winter. So winter is the medicine of dreaming. It's a time of
Mhm.
going within. It's a time, perhaps our listeners are sleeping more, dreaming more. What
Mhm. Mhm.
aspect of us being in harmony with the rhythms of the natural world. And so that's another way that we can continue to connect with her, right? And
Yeah.
so aligning with the rhythms and the cycles, this is a time of deep introspection, reflection, recapitulation, and going within. And so
Mhm.
as a consequence, there may be things that we look at in terms of the traumas and the abuse and the patterns, the issues, the wounds, the addictions that we may have experienced or are currently grappling with. And this is our time to look at that and to
Yeah.
reach out for help, right?
You know, as you're talking, I'm kind of evolving a little bit, I think, about the way that I think about the word indigenous, because I think before, talking to you, I sort of thought indigenous is a group of people that I will never relate to. And what I'm hearing you say is indigenous is just the vast amounts of wisdom and ceremonies and sacred medicine that we all could have access to if we would just slow down and consider it as being something that I could not claim, but could benefit from or could remember or something. My ego wants to say claim, right? Um, but to your point, like just because maybe you walk on the ground with bare feet and like that doesn't mean that I can't. It's like you're saying, like there's these things that we can do that can just be pulled from that indigenous energetic field that might just help us in a little bit of a way, rather than thinking this is a separate group of people that are on this in this country that are fighting for something that doesn't matter to me. And that's not all I'm hearing. And so it's kind of helping me just evolve my thinking a little bit. So I appreciate what you're saying a lot.
Beautiful. Absolutely.
Yeah.
There's certainly, there are nations, indigenous nations that have an unbroken lineage of connection from that ancestral understanding about
Wow.
the earth and the unseen, the
Yeah.
ancestors and the helping spirits that we have. So, we definitely want to acknowledge them, just like, the people here in the San Francisco Bay watershed, right? The indigenous nations I mentioned. That's an unbroken lineage. And of course, there
Mm.
has been genocide and atrocities that have been perpetrated by colonized interests and beings. And then, of course, we have individuals that are more westernized. And I would say that there's been a process of forgetting, right?
Okay.
Process of de distancing from that fundamental awareness, right?
Yeah.
That's the ground of colonization. But at the heart of every human being is, for me, an indigenous person. We're all from the earth and we will go back to her. And we may have had at some point along our own lineages individuals that had that connection that some indigenous nations now have continued to have, and which is unbroken for them, but is disconnected from many Western people today.
Yeah. So this feels like the most ridiculous question I've ever asked, but what you're saying is making me think, okay, if I think of my own lineage, right, of being German, let's say,
Mhm.
would you encourage someone like me to go back through that, or would you encourage someone like me to come to someone like you, or like what or both? Like how would you encourage someone to sort of grapple with that? Like you said, I've lost all of my sense of my ancestry, you
Mhm.
know. because I just didn't think it was relevant. I think, well, that's Hitler, don't go there, you know? I mean,
Right.
just to be simple, in a simplified
Sure,
way.
I understand. Well, so I would say all of the above. So, I encourage you and all of our listeners here to make sure that you understand, your genealogy, right?
Mm.
But if you go back far enough, right? So, who were the indigenous peoples of Europe? Well, you have the
Yeah, great
Druids.
question.
Well, I can answer that for you. You
Yeah.
have the Druids and the Celts, right? And the Wiccan tradition. So
Okay.
that was the indigenous peoples of Europe prior to their extermination as a consequence of the Crusades, right? So
Wow.
this is about understanding history, right? So, under the guise of the church and at the time, the Crusaders went on what? The quest of the Holy Grail.
Yes.
And that was a justification for the extermination of indigenous people, as well as um, conquest of land, right? And
Yeah.
so, we're seeing this thing, continuing to play itself out, right? Even in the
Yeah.
modern stage now. So that's my first encouragement is to explore your own genealogy,
Yeah.
as well as to connect with, or at least become aware of the indigenous peoples that may be a part of your own personal history, right? Now, I have people from all walks of life, right? Because this is about, decolonization and about re-indigenization and that remembrance. And so, I have individuals from all cultures, races, etc., who will come and study with myself or receive healing. And so, the beauty of several indigenous nations that have that unbroken lineage is that it fosters a container for remembrance to happen,
Mm.
right? So, even say within many indigenous nations here in the Americas who through genocide may have lost that connection, there's a few nations such as the Lakota and others who, as a consequence of that unbroken lineage, have been able to support indigenous nations who got disconnected as a result of assimilation and genocide.
Oh, wow.
So there's many individuals that benefit by participating in traditional ceremonies, maybe from it's not a part of their lineage, but it helps them to remember and reconnect with that. And
Wow.
so, that's something that I certainly would encourage your listeners and yourself to do. So, therefore, for example, in my families, we have an open altar, which means every human being is welcome to come and pray and participate and receive healing and
Wow.
awakening that remembrance for them.
That's amazing. And it doesn't matter in your ceremonies or in the healing, it doesn't matter what your lineage is at all. It doesn't matter if you've even looked into your lineages. You're saying during the ceremony, the container could even bring something for me that has, something to do with my own lineage, not necessarily. Wow, that's really cool. I never knew any of that. And I really appreciate just getting like a touch of like what you're saying. And there's something really cool when I think about that I can be a part of an indigenous, the word indigenous in a way that I didn't understand before.
Mhm.
So I appreciate that a lot. So
Yeah,
how can people
absolutely.
find you if they do decide to look for you? Or I think I found you on LinkedIn, but
I am on LinkedIn. That's one of the platforms. Best way to reach me is by phone, 415-310-0981. And you can either call or text. I mean, coming from an oral tradition, I love to engage this way.
yeah,
So they can reach me that way. They can also reach me via email at Philip, Phillip, at ancestralvoice.org. Um, I have a website, ancestralvoice.org, as well as Instagram. And so those are primarily the ways to reach me. There's also Facebook, Instagram, the website, and then my phone number.
Awesome. Well, you're the second person I've had on the podcast that gave out their phone number, and I'm like, boy, that's rare. But it's good to know that people are willing to talk still on the phone. It's just not doesn't happen that often. So, but to your point, like that is one of the ways we connect, and that's what you're trying to do is reconnect whoever's willing, or at least remember. So,
Indeed. Well, it's
yeah,
about placing the being back in human, and so,
yeah,
how we engage this way, that's part of our human story,
yeah,
and so, and I enjoy conversation. I enjoy dialogue, which is actually, we need more of that, with the disintegration of so many relationships. It's primarily because people are afraid to pick up the phone and have maybe some difficult conversations, right? And so
yeah.
it's about, fostering communication and allowing for dialogue and for accord to occur, or even discord, because every misunderstanding can bring greater clarity when people are willing to commit to stick with the process to be able to come to deeper understanding.
Gosh, I so agree with you. And, that's why I thought I wanted to have a podcast in the middle of a million other podcasts, because I thought we can't have enough conversations about this, and we can't have enough perspectives, because every perspective matters and every healer is adding something. And I just want people to know what's out there, and whatever resonates with you, please consider doing it. So I hope this resonates with some people. It was really, really great to talk to you.
It's an absolute pleasure, and prayerfully they will reach out if they need some help. And as I said, there are really potent healing practices within indigenous cultures, ceremonially as well as modalities, that can be very efficacious in helping people to heal.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. And I hope you have a great rest of your day.
My pleasure. Likewise, and blessings.